My friends, thank you so much for joining us for another episode of Listen In. And today we're talking about picture books for everyone and really thinking about resources to support learning from story. So, my name is Nikki Yi. I am a colonizer of Chinese and Mennonite ancestry, and I am joining you today from the traditional, unceded, and contemporary territories of the Coquitlam people.
And I'm Sarah Florence Davidson. My Haida name is Anja Gusandlans, which means Killer Whale Woman of the Dawn. And I'm joining you from the unceded territories of the Kitsi, the Kwantlen, and the Semiahmoo peoples.
Thanks. And just a shout out to Raquel Martin, PhD, who really inspired us to start filming these little discussions as a way to make our scholarship accessible. So thanks to them. So today we're chatting about picture books for everyone. And Sarah, you are brilliant at incorporating picture books for everyone. And so I want to learn more about this. I have some questions for you, and just looking forward to our chat today. So I thought, just as maybe an introduction, like what are some sort of defining features of picture books that you would use, across different ages?
So I think that for me, in terms of choosing the picture books, I like to like if I'm thinking, especially for older learners, I'll just maybe qualify that a lot of what I'm saying is for older learners because I think we're used to using picture books with younger learners. But I will say for older learners, I tend to use nonfiction stories or stories that could be close to nonfiction because those tend to be ones that would work for any age. I also use traditional Indigenous stories with older learners, and I find those tend to work quite well. And the focus that I've sort of been loosely using is a focus on learning. So similar to what you were talking about in our last episode, just sort of that idea of teaching learning through these stories and thinking about learning. And I find but I find those topics or those kinds of books tend to be the ones that work really well into working with the older learners.
But your idea of learning and what you're talking about is a bit different than what I was like, because I'm teaching it from like educational psychology perspective, and you are teaching more from that sort of Indigenous pedagogies perspective. Do you want to talk a bit more about that?
For sure. And I think that so it came in one of the courses that I was teaching at the university level was a introduction to Indigenous education, and one of the ideas that we were exploring in that course was learning about Indigenous pedagogies, which is a big long way of saying, teaching and learning in, I would say, pre-contact ways with Indigenous peoples, and how is knowledge shared from generation to generation in these Indigenous communities. And so I think so much can be learned from that, and so this idea of using the picture books specifically to work with those ideas. And so
This one?
yes, absolutely. Well, and I do appreciate you bringing those up because that was part of the inspiration for those books. Was the series of the Scotta stories was really focused on the Scotta principles, which are Haida pedagogical principles around learning. And so, but I also teach here in what is now BC, and we have the First Peoples Principles of Learning here that we have incorporated into our curriculum. And I find that those, using the picture books and making sure that those picture books have uh, illustrations of some of those principles in them, meant that students were able to listen to the story and to think about and see in action those principles. And so, specifically with the Scotta stories, the thinking was that after I worked on potlatches pedagogy with my father, and really that was sort of this is how the learning took place. I thought, I wonder if these picture books could perhaps work differently. And so educators who maybe didn't have experiences living or learning on the land could have this opportunity to go fishing with my father or to go learning how to fish with my brother and my cousin and I. And so having those opportunities to have those experiences, and then the other two are learning art and learning how to culture. And so the picture book provides this opportunity because we tend to read it aloud. It means that whoever's reading the story has this opportunity to be immersed in the experience, and then also sharing that with the learners means that the learners are also having this experience that they may not necessarily have, but based on where they are currently living.
Mhm. And I have to say that I thought the picture books were absolutely brilliant. And that is why I always bring them up every time. But what I loved, Sarah, what I really, really loved is because, of course, you published Potlatch's Pedagogy first and talked about the Scouter principles. And then when I was reading it, I was like, yeah, of course, like this makes sense. And, all of the things, like I felt like I could understand it. And then when the picture books came out, I was like, oh yeah, okay, so now I understand what you were talking about. Like it just gives that sort of embedded example that I felt like was so important. So, anyways,
And
thank you for writing.
I think it's important to note that those stories were the stories that my father shared with me, for me to learn about the Scottish principles. And I think sometimes if we think about stories, um, sometimes in the way that we work in mainstream spaces, we think about like, oh, what is the story that I can create to illustrate a particular point? And these stories were not created to illustrate those Scottish principles. These stories were the lived experiences that my father and I had that happened to have those Scottish principles. And these are the stories that my father shared with me in order for me to learn about those principles. And I think that's an important distinction in the stories that I share with in my classrooms and with the students that I work with, is that those stories are not, they haven't been created to illustrate the First Peoples principles of learning or the Scottish principles. They happen to have them embedded as an Indigenous pedagogy in them. And then we can have this experience of learning more about that principle through that story.
And so, Sarah, why picture books?
My picture books, because they're
So,
amazing. I think
so So why did you, so our conversation kind of went
yeah.
someplace that we didn't expect, but why did you choose to write picture books and why would you use picture books and how are they different from using other kinds of media or genre?
Okay, and so this, I will say that I don't, picture books to me are meant to be shared. They are a literacy practice that we don't do in isolation. It's rare for, I mean, I do enjoy sitting down and reading a picture book, but I really love reading them. I even still, like, I read them to my mom now, and like I still have that experience of sharing picture books. They really, really invite a kind of a shared experience, if you will, a listener and a storyteller experience. So that would be the first thing. I love working with the images. I love feeling completely immersed. And I think often when we read text-based stories, we have what we imagine in our minds. And so you and I could listen to the story. We would have these different experiences of what we imagine in our minds based on what we're listening to. But a picture book really invites us both into this shared space, which is quite amazing. And I think, in terms of working with the illustrator, Janine Gibbons, we, it was really important to me that she understand Haida for those particular stories because it needed to reflect these experiences, the land there, and so that people who had maybe not been there would have this opportunity to experience it in ways that they might not if the illustrator had not fully understood or been from the place. So, but I would also say they're very short. The picture books that I wrote with my father are just 7 minutes to read. So they provide us this opportunity for a very rich experience. We can engage with lots of different voices, lots of different authors, different illustrators, and in a very short time. And that also means that we can share them with the class, for example, at the beginning of at the beginning of a class and we can all have the experience with the same text. I don't know when I first started working with picture books in an official capacity, but I will say that I started working with short texts, and started thinking about how to work with short texts as a result of this textbook called Less is More, by Kimberly Hill Campbell. And when I was working in Whitehorse, I had a lot of students who didn't come every day, and I wanted them to be able to, for whatever day they showed up, I wanted them to be able to fully participate in my class. And so what that meant is that I had to really think about and I was teaching English at the time, and I had to think about like, what are the texts that I'm bringing in for them to engage with? And I didn't want to be in the middle of a novel and have them show up on the day that we're doing chapter 8 and then they don't understand what's going on. So I wanted them to feel like they were fully welcomed, they could fully participate on whatever day they showed up. And so this idea of working with these shorter texts, I will say that the less is more is quite dated, but I love the emphasis on we can do all of the curricular requirements with these shorter texts that really invite engagement, and I would say remove a lot of barriers for students. I find that the language is accessible. Having images means that I can really, really access the story and focus in on whatever it is that I need to teach connected to that story. But I just love how inclusive they are for all of the different students that I worked with. And there is that experience. I will say that for me personally, I loved having stories read to me as a child. And so hearing anybody read me a story, like I just feel like it's a gift, and I feel like I have a relationship with that person. And so I think I've worked with lots of different ages. I've worked with practicing teachers. I've worked with first year students. I've worked with high school students, and everybody has been super receptive to hearing stories. And it was one area that when I was doing professional development for folks teaching English First Peoples, that was an area that they were really excited about developing. And so we talked about ways to bring these picture books into high school classrooms, especially.
Mm, yeah. And I think that you have really shown that picture books are not simple necessarily. I mean, they can be simple, but you can really engage with those deep and sort of sophisticated ideas um, without using long texts, right? It's like, so it's not that there's nothing that we can learn from picture books. There's a lot to learn from them. Um, but we don't necessarily have to be reading like, I don't know, whatever,
Well,
academic texts.
absolutely. And I think, I mean, top secret, my mom and I were working on a project, and I had this idea for a picture book. And so we're working on this academic project together, and this idea for a picture book, because again, that idea of the accessibility of a picture book and the ideas. And so, yes, we're working on this thing that will probably eventually end up as an academic paper, but what I'm really excited about is how do we share these ideas more broadly and with more people. And um, the the Scada stories, they're actually 1,000-word narrative essays, and I try and share that with high school teachers who are thinking about ways to bring them into, bringing them in with older learners. And so I would call them learning stories. So they're all stories about experiences of learning. And so I invite students to write their own stories of learning. And, but also just this idea that, we have these, how can I say this? What I'm really excited about is that these are the Scottish stories are these moments in time. They're days in my life. And I hope that they're relatable, and I guess I hope that inspires people to share their own experiences of learning. And some of the most beautiful, beautiful stories that students have written in my class have been through these invitations to share their own experiences of learning, and in these narrative essays, and just the relationship that develops with them as a result. And so I feel like maybe they started with these stories, maybe it gave them a space to share those stories. And and yeah, so I feel really excited about that as a medium, and um, very excited about the ways that we can bring picture books into all classrooms, all learning spaces.
Mhm. Well, thank you so much for your insights. I know that I learned a lot, and I hope that people who are watching this learned a lot too. So thank you, friends, for joining us, and we'll see you next time.
We will definitely see you next time. Thank you so much.